Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we bring you forgotten stories of America's past dailies that shaped the land, the people, and the soul of our nation. Before we begin today's story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into America's history. Now, let us step back in time. The year was 1883, and the little town of Harrodsburg, Kentucky, lay quiet beneath the soft roll of the bluegrass hills. It was a place where life moved slowly, where folks rose with the crow of the rooster and ended their day when the lamps ran low. The rhythm of the seasons ruled their lives, and the church bell on Sunday was the heartbeat that kept the town together. Every Sunday morning, rain or shine, families walked along the dirt roads, their boots caked with mud or dust, their best clothes pressed and neat. They made their way to the white clapboard church at the center of town. The church was simple but proud, standing with its steeple pointed toward heaven, its bell pulling the whole valley together in worship. It was not only a place of prayer, but the stage where every face in town was seen, every voice lifted in hymn, and every soul judged, whether by God above or by the sharp eyes of neighbors in the pews. Among the most faithful, no family shone brighter than the Whitlocks. They lived on the edge of town, in a sturdy farmhouse built by the patriarch's own hands. The father, Elias Whitlock, was a man carved from the soil itself, broad-shouldered, quiet, and solemn. He spoke sparingly but worked tirelessly, tilling the land, tending to horses, and repairing fences until his back bowed under the weight of years. His wife, Margaret, was his match in diligence. She kept a strict house, polished the silver, and made sure her children looked like a portrait of God-fearing respectability every Sunday morning. They had 4 children, each one well-scrubbed and well-dressed, with hair combed smooth and voices strong when the hymns began. To the outside world, the Whitlocks were the picture of devotion. Elias led his family into the church with a Bible tucked under his arm. Margaret's hat was always adorned with a fresh ribbon. The children sat perfectly still during sermons, never fidgeting, never whispering, their eyes fixed on the preacher, as though every word was a golden key to heaven's gate. And the townsfolk noticed. They whispered with admiration, not envy. For in a place as small as Harrodsburg, reputation was worth more than coin. The Whitlocks never miss a service. Old Mrs. Clancy would say, "That's a family blessed by the Lord." Another would nod in agreement, adding, "If everyone was as steadfast as Elias and Margaret, there'd be no sin left in this town." But behind the polished shoes and pressed collars, behind the bowed heads and closed eyes, there was something else, something unspoken, something buried. The truth was that the Whitlocks' devotion, so carefully displayed, was not born of love for God, nor even fear of judgment. It was born of necessity, of control, and of a dark secret that the family carried like a stone in their chest. Their Sundays were not acts of faith, but performances, carefully rehearsed, because beneath the hymns they sang and the prayers they whispered, their home was ruled by shadows. In the daylight, when neighbors passed by, the Whitlock home seemed like any other, a wide porch with a rocking chair, the smell of cornbread drifting from the kitchen, the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind. But when the lamps were lowered and the curtains drawn, the laughter gave way to silence, and silence gave way to whispers that the walls themselves seemed to hold. Elias, the respected patriarch, was a man burdened not only by work, but by rage. He carried scars from the Civil War, scars no one in town spoke of aloud. He had been young when he joined, just 19, fighting for the Confederacy with more fire than understanding. He returned broken not in body, but in spirit. The things he had seen, the things he had done, had twisted something deep inside him. By the time he came home to Kentucky, the boy who had marched off to war was gone, And in his place stood a man whose silence could curdle the air in a room. Margaret, his wife, bore her own weight. She had been raised in a family where appearances mattered more than truth. Her father had been a church deacon, her mother a woman of strict rules. From her earliest days, she had been taught that sin could be scrubbed away, not by confession, but by denial and discipline. And so she scrubbed her children's faces until they shone, scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, and scrubbed her own memory clean of anything that might threaten the family's good name. The children lived in the middle of this silent storm. To the world, they were model sons and daughters. Inside the home, they walked on eggshells, their every word measured, their every step weighed. Their father's temper could flare without warning, a sudden explosion of fists against the table, or words sharp enough to draw blood. Their mother's discipline was colder an icy stare, a swift strike with the back of her hand, a punishment that lingered not in bruises but in shame. And yet every Sunday morning the family rose early. Margaret pressed the children's clothes. Elias polished his boots, and they marched to church as though nothing was amiss. They sang louder than anyone, their voices steady, their eyes closed in pious devotion. It was a mask they wore so well that even the preacher himself praised them. "If only all families could be like the Whitlocks," he said one Sunday from the pulpit, "steadfast in faith, upright in conduct, shining examples for all of us." But the preacher did not see what lay beneath late that summer of 1883. Rumors began to stir. They were whispers at first, carried between neighbors on porches and over fences. Someone said they heard shouting late at night from the Whitlock house. Someone else claimed they saw one of the children, Mary, the eldest daughter, running through the field at dusk with tears on her cheeks. A farmhand swore that Elias had been drinking more than usual, his once quiet demeanor souring into drunken. RANTS. The town, of course, dismissed such talk. "Every family has their troubles," they'd say. "The Whitlocks are good churchgoers. Don't speak ill of them." But the whispers grew louder, and the mask began to crack. One Sunday, as the congregation rose to sing, Mary's voice faltered. Her hymn book trembled in her hands. Her younger brother, Samuel, stared at the floor, his lips barely moving. Elias' jaw tightened, his hand gripping the pew so hard his knuckles turned white. Margaret forced a smile, her hand resting stiffly on her lap, but her eyes betrayed a storm. It was small, a moment so fleeting most would not notice. But for those who did, it planted a seed of doubt. Something was not right in the Whitlock family. Something hid beneath the hymns they sang so sweetly. That summer dragged on, the air thick with heat, the fields golden with harvest. Life in Heradsburg continued, slow and steady, but within the Whitlock house, the shadows grew heavier. Margaret began keeping the curtains drawn, even in daylight. Elias spent more nights in the barn than in his own bed. The children moved like ghosts, speaking only when spoken to, their laughter silenced, their joy smothered. And then came the night of August 18th, 1883. It began with thunder rolling across the hills, a storm that rattled the windows and shook the timbers of the farmhouse. Inside, the family gathered in the parlor, the lamps turned low, the sound of rain drumming on the roof. Elias sat in his chair, a bottle at his side, his eyes fixed on nothing. Margaret sewed in silence, her needle piercing cloth with sharp, steady jabs. The children huddled together, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. The storm outside raged, but it was the storm inside that would never be forgotten. That night, something broke in the Whitlock house. Something long buried clawed its way to the surface. And though the town would never speak of it openly, though the church pews would remain filled with bowed heads and folded hands, the truth of what happened beneath the hymns would haunt Heradsburg for generations. The storm that night was no ordinary storm. It was one of those Kentucky tempests that seemed to rip open the very sky, where lightning painted the hills in ghostly light and thunder cracked like cannon fire across the valley. The rain came in, torrents, drumming against the tin roof until the sound swallowed every thought, every word. Inside the Whitlock house, the lamps shook in their sconces, and shadows danced like specters across the walls. Elias sat in the parlor, his boots muddy, his shirt half unbuttoned, a bottle of sour whiskey in his hand. The war had left him with scars no doctor could heal, and when storms rolled through, they seemed to drag the past back into the room with him. Sometimes he swore he could hear gunfire in the thunder. Sometimes he shouted at ghosts only he could see. Margaret pretended not to notice, stitching furiously at her sewing, as though her needle could sew order into chaos. The children were gathered on the rug, Mary clutching her younger brothers close. Samuel, only 10, shivered at each crack of thunder, though he would never admit it aloud. The youngest, little Ruth, whimpered and buried her face in Mary's lap. Mary was 14 that summer, but her face carried the weight of a grown woman's sorrow. She had learned too young to shield her siblings, how to carry burdens her parents refused to bear. The night stretched long. Elias muttered under his breath. Fragments of prayers and curses mingled into a haze of whiskey and memory. At one point, he slammed his fist against the table, the sound sharp enough to make Ruth cry out. Margaret did not look up. She stitched, and stitched, her lips pressed tight, her eyes cold. At last, Elias rose from his chair, his bottle swinging loosely in his hand. He staggered toward the stairs, his shadow large against the wall. The children froze. They knew what storms often brought. A storm outside was one thing. A storm inside the Whitlock house was another. Margaret stood abruptly, setting aside her sewing. Elias, she said sharply, her voice cutting through the roar of rain. It's late. Leave them be. Her husband turned, his eyes red, his jaw tight. You think you can command me in my own house? His words slurred, but the anger behind them was clear. I think, Margaret answered, her chin lifted, that the children have suffered enough. For a moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Elias swayed, his fists clenching at his sides. The children clung to one another, waiting, listening, hoping the storm outside would drown whatever violence might follow. But instead, Elias laughed. It was a low, bitter sound, the kind of laugh that chills rather than comforts. He turned away, stumbling toward the door that led to the barn. With a sharp tug, he pulled it open, letting the storm's fury sweep into the parlor. Then, without another word, he vanished into the rain, the door slamming shut behind him. Margaret exhaled, her shoulders sagging with a weariness she did not show often. She turned to the children, her face still stern, but her voice softer. Upstairs now, all of you. The children obeyed, their small feet padding up the staircase. Mary lingered a moment, her eyes on her mother. For a flicker of a second, Margaret's mask cracked. There was fear in her eyes, not of the storm, not even of Elias, but of something deeper, something buried. She caught herself quickly, turned away, and began clearing Elias's empty glass from the table. Mary climbed the stairs. With that image seared into her mind, the storm raged until dawn. When Elias returned, drenched and silent, no one spoke. By the time the church bell rang that Sunday morning, the Whitlocks were dressed and ready, their boots polished, their hair combed, their Bibles in hand. No one in the pews would have guessed what had unfolded only hours before, but the storm had changed something. The cracks in the family's facade were widening, and it would not be long before the whole town began to see. That autumn, the whispers grew harder to ignore. Mary was seen at the well one morning, her hands red and raw, scrubbing her dress as though she could wash away something more than dirt. A neighbor, Mrs. Carter, claimed she found Samuel wandering near her property at dawn, barefoot and shivering, refusing to explain why he wasn't at home. And Ruth, sweet little Ruth, stopped speaking altogether in public. She clung to Mary's skirt whenever they walked to town, her eyes downcast, her mouth pressed shut as though afraid that even a single word might betray her. The preacher, Reverend Holloway, was not blind to these changes. He was a tall man, with kind eyes and a voice that carried both thunder and comfort from the pulpit. He had known the Whitlocks for years, had praised their devotion more times than he could count. But now he watched Elias closely during services, the way his jaw tightened when Mary shifted uncomfortably beside him, the way Margaret's hands gripped her hymnal until her knuckles WHENED. One Sunday in late October, after the congregation had dispersed, Reverend Holloway called out to Elias as he strode toward the door. "Brother Whitlock," he said warmly, "a word, if you please." Elias stiffened, but turned, his hat in his hands. The Reverend's smile was gentle, but his eyes were sharp. "I trust all is well at home?" "All is as it should be," Elias answered curtly. The Reverend nodded, though he did not believe it. "If ever you or your family need counsel, my door is open. Sometimes burdens are easier when shared." Elias's lips curled in something between a sneer and a smile. "We carry our own burdens, Reverend. Always have." He tipped his hat and strode out, his family following in silence. The Reverend watched them go, unease gnawing at his heart. He could feel it now. There was a darkness clinging to that family, a weight no hymn could lift. Winter settled over Kentucky with biting winds and frosted fields. The Whitlock farm grew quiet, the family rarely seen in town except on Sundays. Yet even in the bitter cold, the facade of devotion held. They sang louder than ever, their voices rising in hymns that echoed through the church rafters. But those who looked closely could see the strain. Mary's cheeks were pale, her eyes shadowed. Samuel's hands shook when he turned the pages of the hymnal. Margaret's smile was brittle, and Elias's face was carved into stone. And then, one bitter night in January of 1884, the secret finally broke through. It was near midnight when a scream cut through the frozen air, so sharp and desperate it carried across the fields to the nearest neighbor. Mr. Albright, a farmer who lived a half-mile away, roused from sleep and rushed outside. In the stillness of the winter night, the sound was unmistakable. It came from the Whitlock house. He ran through the snow, his lantern swinging in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the farmhouse, the door was ajar, the lamplight flickering within. He called out, but received no answer. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped inside. What he found would forever mark the town of Haradsburg. The parlor was in disarray, a chair overturned, the rug askew. Margaret stood frozen near the fireplace, her hands clasped to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. At her feet, Mary clung to Samuel and Ruth, shielding them with her body, her face streaked with tears. And Elias lay sprawled on the floor, blood seeping from his temple, his eyes vacant and unseeing. The storm that had been brewing inside the Whitlock family for years had at last erupted, and its aftermath would unravel everything the town thought it knew about faith, devotion, and the secrets people hide beneath the hymns. The morning after Elias Whitlock's body was found, the news spread like fire through dry grass. In a town as small as Harrodsburg, word needed no messenger. It carried itself from porch to porch, from the general store to the blacksmith's shop, from one rocking chair to another, until by mid-morning there wasn't a soul who didn't know. "Elias Whitlock is dead," they whispered, struck down in his own parlor. By noon, the white-clabbered church bell tolled slow and solemn, not for Sunday service, but for death. Its sound rolled across the hills, through the bare winter trees, heavy as a funeral dirge. People stopped their work, set aside their tools, and bowed their heads. For all his faults, and there were whispers of them even then, Elias had been a fixture, a man of the soil, a man of the pew. His absence would leave a mark. The official word came from the county coroner. Elias had struck his head in a fall. A drunken stumble, most likely. The blow to his temple had ended him before Margaret could even cry for help. That was the tale written on the paper, signed and sealed by the authorities. But among the townsfolk, the whispers turned darker. Some swore they had heard Margaret's scream echoing across the fields, a sound not of grief but of terror. Others said Mary's face that morning, pale as snow and silent as stone, told a story no official report would ever put into words. A few wondered aloud why Samuel and Ruth clung so tightly to their sister, as if she were their only shelter in the world, Dot at the funeral. The Whitlocks filled their usual pew, but now Elias's seat stood empty, the polished wood a silent accusation. Margaret wore her black veil low, her hands folded so tightly they trembled. Mary sat stiff and still, her eyes fixed on the coffin at the front of the church, unblinking, as though she dared it to rise again. Samuel and Ruth huddled close, there, small frames swallowed in mourning clothes. The preacher, Reverend Holloway, spoke with grave solemnity. We gather to lay to rest our brother Elias, a man of steadfast faith and enduring strength. His trials are over. His burdens are lifted. May the Lord receive him with mercy. But as his voice echoed through the rafters, more than one person in the pews exchanged a glance. They had seen Elias's temper. They had heard the raised voices from the Whitlock farm. They had noticed the way Margaret's eyes sometimes looked more like flint than faith. And though they bowed their heads, though they sang the hymns, there was a weight in the air that no prayer could lift. After the funeral, life in Harrodsburg pressed on, as it always did. The fields needed tending, the animals needed feeding, the children needed schooling. But for the Whitlocks, the world had shifted on its axis. Elias was gone, and with him the rigid order that had bound the family in fear. Margaret carried on as though nothing had changed. She kept the house spotless, kept the children in their routines, kept the curtains drawn tight. Yet beneath her control there was a hollowness, as if something vital had drained out of her with Elias's last breath. She no longer snapped at the children, no longer struck them for small slights, but neither did she comfort them. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, her footsteps measured, her voice low, her eyes elsewhere. Mary, on the other hand, seemed to grow older overnight. With her father gone and her mother adrift, she became the anchor for her siblings. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire, cooked the meals, and soothed Ruth when nightmares woke her crying. Samuel followed her like a shadow, his young face hardening with a seriousness no child should wear. The three of them clung together, a small island of warmth in a house that had grown unbearably cold. But Harrodsburg could not let go of its curiosity. Whispers followed the Whitlocks wherever they went. At the general store, women leaned close and murmured, "Did you see the bruise on Elias's temple? Do you think he really just fell?" At the blacksmith's, men shook their heads and muttered, "A man doesn't die like that unless there's more to the story." The children felt the stares most of all. At school, Samuel sat alone at his desk, his fists clenched, daring anyone to speak of his father. Ruth barely spoke at all, her silence now a shield as well as a habit. Mary endured it with quiet dignity, her chin lifted, her eyes refusing to meet the gaze of those who sought to pierce her. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hills in shades of fire, Reverend Holloway made his way to the Whitlock farm. He found Margaret in the parlor, her sewing in her lap, the house unnaturally still. She rose politely, offered him tea, and spoke of the weather, the crops, the coming spring. Not once did she mention Elias Dodd at last. The Reverend leaned forward. "Sister Whitlock," he said gently, "I know grief wears many faces, and I know yours may not look like others. But I must ask, are you and the children safe?" Margaret's eyes flickered, just for an instant. Then she smiled, tight and brittle. "We are safe, Reverend. Safer than we have ever been." The words hung heavy between them, and the Reverend felt the truth in them, though he dared not press further. As winter thawed into spring, the Whitlocks continued their ritual. Every Sunday they were in their pew, their hymns rising with the rest of the congregation. Yet now their singing carried a different weight. It was not the polished performance of a family hiding behind faith. It was raw, trembling, uncertain, like a cry rising from deep within. Some in the congregation wept. To hear it, though they could not have said why, still the questions lingered. What had truly happened on the night of August 18th? Had Elias truly fallen, or had something else brought him down? And if so, who in that house bore the secret? One spring afternoon, answers began to creep to the surface. Mrs. Carter, the neighbor who often watched the Whitlock children from afar, claimed she saw Mary in the field, her hands black with dirt, digging furiously at the earth. When Mrs. Carter called out to her, Mary startled, then ran back to the house without a word. Later that night, Samuel was seen carrying a bundle of firewood into the barn long after dark. Though the lamps in the farmhouse burned bright, rumors turned to suspicion. Suspicion turned to stories, and soon Harrodsburg was awash with tales of what might have happened. Some said Elias had struck Mary one time too many, and she had struck back. Others whispered that Margaret herself had ended him, her years of silent suffering boiling over at last. A few, darker still, wondered if the children together had found the courage to free themselves from their father's wrath. But none of the Whitlocks spoke a word. Not Margaret, not Mary, not Samuel, not Ruth. They moved through town with their heads high and their mouths shut, carrying their secret as tightly as they carried their Bibles. The silence was its own confession. By summer, the Whitlock farm bore the look of a place caught between ruin and rebirth. The fields grew wild at the edges. The fences leaned. The paint peeled from the clapboard walls. Yet there was also laughter, faint but real, drifting from the porch on warm evenings when Mary told stories to her siblings. There was freedom, too, in the way Samuel ran through the fields barefoot, no longer afraid of his father's voice calling him back. And Ruth, though still quiet, began to hum little tunes as she played, her voice like a fragile thread stitching their broken lives together. The town did not know what to make of it. Some pitied the family, offering casseroles and help with the farm. Others kept their distance, uneasy with the sense that something unholy had passed through the Whitlock house. But all agreed on one thing. The Whitlocks had changed, and nothing would ever be the same. And yet, as autumn of 1884 approached, the truth that had been buried with Elias began to claw its way out again. Because secrets, no matter how tightly held, have a way of rising. And when they rise, they do not come gently. The family who never missed church had become the family everyone whispered about. But the darkest part of their story, the truth of what really happened that stormy night still, lay hidden, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be denied. By the fall of 1884, the Whitlock story had become more than whispers. It was a wound that would not close, a shadow that stretched over Harrodsburg, no matter how brightly the sun shone. The town had buried Elias in the churchyard, had mourned him with bowed heads and hymns, but it had not buried the unease. For every sermon about forgiveness, there were two conversations about what might have happened in that farmhouse on the night of his death. Margaret seemed determined to outlast the talk. She carried herself through town with her veil still drawn, her back straight, her words measured. At church she sat in the same pew, sang the same hymns, and never faltered when eyes turned her way. To those who asked if she was managing, she gave the same answer: "The Lord provides." She would not say more, and she would not bend. But children do not wear masks as easily as their parents. Samuel grew restless, fidgeting in the pew, his once bright eyes hardening into a watchful stare. Ruth clung tighter to Mary than ever, still silent in public, but now haunted even in her play. And Mary, poor Mary, had begun to carry herself, not like a girl of 15, but like a woman twice that age, her face pale, her gaze heavy, her shoulders squared against the world. The preacher, Reverend Holloway, watched all this with a heart weighed down by worry. He had prayed for guidance, prayed for strength, prayed for the right words. One Sunday after service, as the congregation spilled into the cool autumn air, he called softly, "Mary, child, a word with you?" She paused, her siblings close by, her mother already walking ahead. The Reverend crouched so his eyes met hers. "You are carrying something heavy. I see it in you. The Lord does not ask us to carry our burdens alone. If you ever wish to speak, you need only come to me." For a long moment Mary said nothing. Her lips parted, then closed again. Her eyes glistened, but she shook her head. "I can't, Reverend," she whispered. And then she turned and hurried after her mother, Ruth clutching her skirt. The Reverend stood watching her go, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He had the dreadful sense that if the truth ever did come out, it would not come gently. That truth began to claw its way to the surface one crisp October morning when Mrs. Carter, the Whitlocks' nearest neighbor, walked past their field on her way to town. She noticed something unusual near the old oak tree at the edge of the property, a patch of earth disturbed, as though recently dug and poorly covered. She thought little of it at first. Farmers dug holes for many things, but the image gnawed at her as she walked. When she mentioned it to her husband that evening, his face went pale. "Best leave it be," he muttered. "The Whitlocks' land is their own, but Mrs. Carter could not let it rest." She told another neighbor, and within a week the whole town was whispering about the patch of earth beneath the oak. Some claimed it was nothing more than a place where Samuel had buried a pet. Others said it was where Elias's ghost still walked, restless because his true story had not been told. The sheriff, pressed by gossip and uneasy himself, rode out to the Whitlock farm. He found Margaret on the porch, her sewing in her lap, her children silent nearby. He dismounted, tipped his hat, and said carefully, "Mom, there's been talk. I'd like to take a look at the ground near that oak tree." Margaret's eyes met his, sharp and unflinching. For a moment, the sheriff thought she might refuse outright, but then she gave the faintest of nods. "Do as you will." The sheriff walked out to the tree, the children's eyes following him. He knelt, pressed his hand against the earth, then rose and returned. Looks like nothing more than a place where dirt was shifted. Nothing to it. But when he left, Mary turned to her mother and whispered, "He'll come back." Margaret's hand tightened around her sewing until her knuckles turned white. "Then we'll be ready," she said softly. In truth, the disturbed earth had been a shallow burial. On that stormy night more than a year earlier, after Elias had fallen and struck his head, Margaret had ordered Mary and Samuel to help her. Together they had dragged his body through the rain, across the muddy yard, and into the shadow of the oak. They had dug with frantic hands, their fingers raw, their tears mingling with the storm. They buried him quickly, without prayer, without marker. Only later, when the coroner arrived and asked for the body, had Margaret concocted the story of a fall in the parlor, moving Elias back inside to make it seem so the patch of earth had been forgotten in the chaos, but the land remembered. And now, it seemed, The town would not let it stay forgotten either. As winter came on, the whispers grew sharper. Children at school taunted Samuel, calling him a gravedigger, a liar's son. Ruth, unable to bear the weight, cried at night until Mary hushed her. Margaret grew sterner, insisting that the family hold their heads high, that they sing louder, that they never, ever speak of what had been done. But secrets, once stirred, are like ghosts. They do not return to their rest. One bitter January evening, Mary appeared at the door of the parsonage. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling. Reverend Holloway welcomed her in, set her by the fire, and waited. For a long time she said nothing. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, she spoke. "He didn't just fall," she said. "He was going to hurt Ruth. He was drunk, and he grabbed her. Mama told me to get between them. He hit me. He hit Samuel, and then he stumbled. His head struck the corner of the table. There was so much blood. Mama said no one would believe us, that they'd call it murder, that we'd lose everything. She told us we had to bury him. She told us we had to sing louder on Sunday, so no one would ever know." Tears streamed down her face as the words poured out, words held too long, words that burned on their way out. "We didn't kill him, Reverend, but we buried him, and we've been burying ourselves ever since." The Reverend sat in silence, the fire crackling beside them. He saw now the truth he had feared, that the Whitlocks' devotion had not been faith but a shield, their hymns not praise but a plea. When Mary left that night, the Reverend promised her only this: "The Lord knows the truth, child, and the truth will set you free." But truth is a dangerous thing in a small town. The Reverend did not speak publicly of Mary's confession, but rumors have a way of traveling faster than words ever spoken. Within weeks, the story was out that Elias had been violent, that his death had not been the accident, it seemed, that the Whitlocks had hidden him beneath the oak. Some pitied them, some condemned them. Some crossed the road to avoid them altogether. By spring of 1885, the Whitlock family was no longer the model of faith they had once been. They still filled their pew, still lifted their voices in hymns. But the congregation listened differently now. Each note carried the weight of sorrow, each verse a reminder of what lay beneath. Margaret aged rapidly, her hair turning silver, her back bending under the weight of all she had carried. Samuel left school early, choosing instead to work the fields, his hands blistered, his jaw set. Ruth slowly found her voice again, though it trembled when she spoke. And Mary became the quiet heart of the family, her girlhood lost to. Secrets too heavy for her years, the oak tree still stood at the edge of the property, its roots tangled deep in the soil that had once hidden a body. Some said on stormy nights they could hear whispers there, the echo of a man's anger carried on the wind. Others said the oak had taken the darkness into itself, leaving the children free at last. But Harrodsburg never forgot. For decades after, whenever a family seemed too perfect, too devout, too polished in the pews, someone would murmur, "Remember the Whitlocks. Remember what hid beneath the hymns." It became a warning, a lesson passed down like scripture, that no matter how loudly a family sang, no matter how faithfully they filled their pew, the truest story was often told in whispers behind closed doors. And so the Whitlocks' legacy was not one of devotion, but of silence and secrets. A family who never missed church, yet bore a darkness that no hymn could cleanse. The bell still tolls in Harrodsburg on Sundays, calling the faithful to gather. The pews fill, the hymns rise, and the old white church stands as it always has. But if you listen closely, very closely, you might hear another sound woven into the songs, the echo of a girl's voice, trembling but true, finally daring to tell the secret her family once buried beneath the hymns.